Welcome to the podcast, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. The way I've been getting started with guests is by asking this old Zen question from a Zen koan, and I'm just curious what you have to say about it. So the question is, all things return to the one. Where does the one return to?
So the first thing that comes to mind is this phrase "returning to," right? So my sort of and I have been receiving Buddhist teachings for some time now, and Zen is this very particular sect of Buddhism. So, and I don't pretend to be an expert in that. So, but the basic Buddhist teaching is that everything arises out of consciousness, and this sort of pure state of consciousness is the Buddhists refer to it as nothing.
Right.
Like
Emptiness.
so many of my friends who also study Buddhism, it's our big joke that they need a new PR person. Part of the reason that Buddhism is so difficult to grasp or to hold someone's interest in the West is that, like, that doesn't sound very appealing. Like, why do you want to go to nothingness, right? But I also sort of, like, from my own personal spiritual perspective, think of like nothing and everything as being the same thing.
Right.
So what I would say, my sort of feeling is that this idea of returning to something means that you have to go away from it before you can come back to it. And what I would say is that 0 point of consciousness, that nothingness, that emptiness, that everythingness, it is. It just is. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't need to come back. So it's the embodied forms that arise out of consciousness that subscribe to the world of impermanence, right? Where everything is arising and falling away constantly. That's
Right.
us. We're the world of form.
Yeah.
But that nothingness just is. That would be my answer.
I love it. Yeah, no, I mean, I feel a similar way whenever because I think from a relative perspective, the retreat and return has reality to it, but from an absolute perspective, the one never goes anywhere. So it doesn't return because it never leaves. So good stuff. All right, I wanted to ask a little bit about your childhood, if that's okay, in the context of spirituality and religion. So did you grow up in a religious context or a religious family?
No, I really didn't. So let me try to get into this state of consciousness of being the child and try to imagine, I think I had a vague notion that my father had been at one time raised in a religious sort of context. He was an ex-Catholic. It's the way he described himself. That said, I didn't really, we didn't talk about religion. In fact, I would even go so far as to say, so my father was a professor of pharmacology. So very much steeped in science and academia. And so I would even go so far as to say that there was a little bit of disdain for religion and spirituality. I think that there was sort of a pall cast over any kind of belief system that couldn't be quantified as in a scientific way. And so I think I carried a bias for some time that I sort of had adopted this view, much like my father, that if you believed in religion, you were stupid.
Right.
So that being said, I think that the causes and conditions of my upbringing were such that I was forced to find sort of a spiritual connection really, really early. There was a significant amount of trauma in my family. I very similarly to many people came from a very dysfunctional home, right? So because I was not receiving any kind of like emotional support through kind of like, you know, emotional self-regulation through my family of origin, it forced me to look out there, you know, and because when you're a little kid, there is no out there within the human realm, right? I mean, like, you know, your family of origin is it. When you're like 2, you're not going to go, okay, you people are screwed up. I'm going to, you know, take my teddy bear and go find an apartment and a job. And, you know, so in essence, I had to go to something. And so really, I took a lot of, I found solace in nature. And I had a very deep connection and felt very much the presence of the spirit of things in nature. So I would talk to rocks and I would talk to trees and I would talk to the sky. And this is how I found a sense of being supported and grounded and taking a bigger view of things. And so I wouldn't have known to say to you that that was a spiritual connection, but looking back in hindsight, it absolutely was.
Nice. Yeah. I think you've said that you discovered tarot around the age of 15. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was I think I was 14.
Okay.
So I moved to Pullman, Washington when I was 13 years old. And the person who introduced me to tarot, I met when I was a freshman in high school. So I think I was 14 years old. And she had a tarot deck. And she and another friend of ours were very, very close. They became my chosen family. And I often, in fact, I was just speaking to Jessie, not the person who introduced me to tarot, but this other friend of ours, that she probably saved my life, actually.
Oh, wow.
Just by being this loving presence who attuned to me, who understood me, right? There was a deep relationship there, and it was something I very much needed at that point in my life. But tarot was this sort of thing that was born out of that kind of magic, the magic of attunement. And Emily, the person who introduced the deck to me, was a very authentic, creative, intelligent, like sensitive individual. And everything about the practice just seemed magical. And it's not like she was an expert, right? She was a couple of years older than me. Those girls were seniors when I was a freshman. So they were a little bit older. And, you know, yet, you know, we would throw these spreads and read out of the stupid booklet, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like, so, you know, it's not like, you know, she was a professional or anything, but we discovered this together. And in fact, you know, several years ago, Emily lives on the East Coast now. She sent me that tarot deck.
Wow.
So I own that. That's in my possession. So
that's incredible.
Yeah, very, very much so. Very special.
Was it the Rider-Waite-Smith deck?
It's the Rider-Waite-Smith, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now that we kind of touched on that before we moved to anything else, I wanted to ask you about decks just briefly. Do you have a favorite deck?
I mean, look, I love that deck. I love that deck for a lot of reasons. I think that Pamela Coleman Smith was a very special artist who had a way of interpreting those archetypes in a really astute way. I mean, just the fact that she illustrated the minor arcana in such a detailed way, like she really brought you into the story of what the meaning of those cards was. And they're so visually pregnant that I feel like when you read with that deck, people receive the information a lot more deeply, right? They're not as reliant on you to make the interpretations because their consciousness is already taking in the meaning of that image that's right before them. And so it speaks on a lot of different levels, right? I really do think for that reason, it's my favorite deck. It's also sort of like, it's traditional. I mean, it's not as old as the oldest deck, right? It's
Right.
not the Visconti Sforza, however you say it, the Italian deck, right?
Yeah.
But it's right. It's early enough that it's still referencing those early esoteric beliefs that were put into the deck. I think it's somewhere around the late 1700s where we first start to see evidence of people using it as a practice of divination, right?
Yeah.
That there's a written record of it. So,
Yeah.
and as far as we know, before that, it was either used as a game like bridge, or, I mean, chances are people were using it for divination. It's just that it wasn't widely publicized yet.
Right. Right.
Because people have been using divination, probably since the dawn of man, right? Since we started forming civilizations,
Yes. Yes.
So
when it comes to the archetypal images on the cards, do you I mean, you've had so much experience with tarot, and I'm sure you kind of have a pretty developed sense of the archetypes of the archetypal significance and kind of underlying current of each card. But I guess my curiosity is, when you're doing a reading for somebody, how much of your interpretation is spontaneous and how much of it is kind of linked to a set understanding of each card, if that makes sense?
I know exactly what you're asking, and I would say it's equal amounts of both. And the way that I describe this, particularly to people who are just learning to use the tarot, and a lot of this is just reflecting back on my own experience of learning to use it, is that first of all, I think of the tarot as a kind of visual language, right? It's, and so with just like any other language, there are these very awkward stages of where you're learning a language and in your mind, you're translating, you think of the English word and then you think of what the Italian word is, and then you say it in Italian. So it's this sort of clunky, learning the vocabulary, learning the sentence structure, learning to put it all together. When you're learning a language, you don't start off writing poetry. You just don't. It's
right.
not, you can't, right? It's like, you're trying to learn to express the most basic of values when you're first learning a language. However, there comes a time where you become so fluent in it that you can express anything instantaneously that comes through your thought process. And it becomes less about quantifying information and more about communicating something that's deeply felt, right? So when I'm reading for somebody, there are several things that'll happen. So as I'm laying the cards out for somebody, I start to instantly get information because I know what the cards mean.
Right.
However, when I start talking about it, I start getting impressions. So as you know, of being a reader, the archetypes represent they're not so specific that there's only one way that these energies can come through. It represents a quantum of what's possible. So I think of the devil as being about addiction, places where we give our power away. This indication that there's some kind of deep existential malaise going on internally that we're trying to fix with external elements, people, places, and things. So I always say to people, if you're looking at addiction, heroin addiction is but one representation of how that can play out in somebody's life. You can also be addicted to relationships, right? I need you to love me before I feel lovable, right? Or I can't be happy until I have this amount of money in the bank, right? So I tend to also stay somewhat loose with my interpretations, because I want the person who I'm reading for to be able to plug it in a way that is meaningful to them. So it's not infinite possibility, right? The devil narrows the energetic field of what it is that you're looking at, but even within that field, there's a realm of possibility for how that energy can play out in a person's life. And obviously all the surrounding cards are going to give you information about that as well. And so you have to know what the cards mean, but then you also have to open up your mind to this imaginal space of how these things co-combine and give subtle information about what that means for the person sitting in front of you. So and some of it is just intuitive, and I will always phrase it like this. Okay, so I'm getting a hit or I'm getting a download. So again, I never want to make myself like an expert, right? I'm not an expert on their life, right? I'm acting as a channel, and ultimately the prayer that I say before I do a reading for every single person is allow me to be a channel for the highest message of good, right? I only want this to be helpful. And so, and because I'm not all seeing and all knowing, I don't necessarily know what that's going to mean. So I have to trust that things are going to come through that need to be heard and acknowledged by the person. And by sort of relinquishing my need to control where it's all going to go, it allows that to happen.
I love it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I really like the analogy of learning a new language, and when you first learn the language, it's more mechanical and awkward, but then you kind of get comfortable with it and you absorb the language, and then that allows you to be more intuitive or poetic with it. In the same way, I think that's a great comparison when you're learning the cards and the archetypes in the cards. It's more of just kind of setting down this foundation, but once you've absorbed those things, then you can kind of allow your intuition to be more in the moment about what it might mean for that specific person or for yourself if you're doing a reading for yourself.
And then the other one more thing I wanted to say about that,
sure.
Because look, obviously I've done a lot of studying. I had teachers that I studied under. I've done a lot of self-study, reading books and whatnot. And what I've noticed is that some of my interpretations are somewhat divergent from what I see other people saying those cards mean. And I sort of labored over that for a while. Like, is that right? Is that okay for me to do that? And I will say that I'm pretty faithful to tradition. But the other thing that I've come to understand is that I have a relationship with the spirit of tarot now. Okay, so tarot knows what my interpretation of a card is, right? And so if that's the energy that needs to be presented in the conscious mind of the person I'm reading for, tarot already knows, okay, that's the one we're going to use to describe this. So my relationship to it is part and parcel for the message that's going to come through. And I'm not worried about that. Like, there are 78 cards in the deck and 78 different representations of human consciousness. That's enough of a range to describe just about everything that we go through in the human condition. And so long as there are representations for those things, spirit knows how to combine those images to create the story that the person needs to become aware of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel the same way sometimes about, like, I feel like my understanding of a specific card, a lot of times it is related or influenced by something that I've read for sure, but then I'll have my own spin on it, and I'll go back to somebody, I'll read somebody else's interpretation of that card again later on, and I'll be like, well, that doesn't quite match up with mine. But, and I've struggled with trying to figure out if that's okay or not. And it feels okay. But yeah, so, we could talk about tarot for a long time. I wanted to make sure, the way that I've been kind of thinking about these episodes and thinking about my own spirituality, and I've been writing a book that's kind of covering these things too. Um, I've been thinking about it in this kind of these three branches. One is experience, two is philosophy, and three is practice.
Mhm.
And so you talked a little bit about your early experiences growing up and finding the tarot and finding your own chosen family and finding people that made you feel seen and heard and understood. And I just wanted to ask if there were any other experiences when you were young or throughout your whole life that either felt like breakthrough slash paradigm shifting slash maybe magical or mysterious that left a big imprint on your life.
Sure. I have so many. And
Yeah.
so let me say probably okay, so I'll give you two really early examples.
Okay.
I believe this first example happened when I was around 2 years old, I think, because it's the first house that I lived in Austin, Texas. And it was and I remember this because of the backyard. I spent a lot of time in that backyard, and I spent a lot of time by myself.
Mm.
So this is one of those times where I was by myself in the backyard, and I watched this little bird fly across the yard and lodge itself in a tiny hole in a rock, and it got stuck. It was stuck there. And even at that age, I remember it so clearly. I mean, I remember it like it happened yesterday. I remember thinking to myself, wow, what are the odds that I was here to witness that event? It was so subtle and so quick that if I hadn't been here to see it, that bird would be dead. But as it were, I saw it, and I went over to that rock, and I had tiny little hands of a 2-year-old, and I pulled that little bird out of the rock.
Wow.
And I was holding it in my little hands, and I could feel its heartbeat. It was,
Wow.
it was so scared, right? And I held it for just a minute. Like, I'm sure it was less than a minute, right? Maybe a couple of seconds, but I connected with the heartbeat of that bird, and then I let it go. And I just remember thinking to myself, that was a miracle. I didn't know what the miracle was, but I knew that was it, right?
Yeah.
I knew that was it, that this intersection of lives that happened that made a profound effect both on me and it, right? Okay, so that's the first one.
Whew, that gave me chills. Keep going.
Right. Okay, so I think I was roughly around the same age, maybe around 3 years old. It was at the same house in Austin, Texas. And my mom had told me to go down for a nap, and I was pissed because I'm like, I don't want a nap. I'm not tired.
Yeah.
And so instead of getting in the bed, and I remember the quality of light, I had these sort of yellow gingham curtains, and the light was filtering through the curtains. So it was this sort of like golden hue of late afternoon sun. And instead of getting in the bed, I sat against the bed with my feet directly out in front of me. And I was staring at my feet. And I was staring at my feet. And I was staring at my feet. And I was in this complete state of relaxation. And then suddenly something happened that I couldn't figure out or consciously register immediately. I'm like, what's happening? I don't understand this. And what I realized is that I was actually staring down at the top of my head. That I was looking at the top of my head with my shoulders out to the sides, and then my legs and my feet out in front. It was a view that I had never had of myself, nor had I had it of anything else, I don't think. I had left my body, and I was staring down at the top of myself. And once that I had that realization, I got scared. I went back in, and all of a sudden I was staring at my feet again. I tried to do it again the next day. I'm like, whoa, what the hell was that? I never could replicate those results. However, I had experiences that were sort of viscerally akin to that up until about the age of 12, when I was going through puberty, where it would be a state of consciousness that I would get into between sleep and awake, where I would feel sort of like conventional reality would melt away. And it was just this weird sensation of things being infinitely large and infinitely small at the same time. It was the same sensation. I didn't know what any of that meant until way later, when I started to study Buddhism and started to hear people talk about the jhanas. And what I realize now is that that was a deep state of concentration that I was meditating. I was meditating before I knew what it was to meditate. And that's what I believe that experience was. So, I mean, how many of these do you want? Okay, let's go on to the next one, because the next one is really important as well. Because what I would say is really the beginning of an actual conscious movement towards spirituality came when I got sober in 1999.
Okay.
So you know, I already sort of touched on this. My family of origin was very troubled. Consequently, I didn't have a lot of skills for how to regulate my own emotions. So I turned to drugs and alcohol as a means of like emotional coping, really.
Yeah.
Which obviously doesn't work.
Yeah.
It causes more problems than it alleviates, right?
Yeah.
So pretty dark time in my life. And I was living in Seattle, Washington. This is around 1994. I was married to a drug dealer who was abusive to me physically. And I was really rudderless and really suicidal. I'll just say that, suicidal. And I didn't know how to get out of it. I knew that this wasn't the life that I had planned on, but I really didn't know how to change it. And I made a movie called The Language of the Birds. Okay? So the movie, so first of all, I just wrote it. It poured out of me in like an hour. Okay. And then I sort of started talking to my friends and like, oh, I want to make this movie. I've never made a movie before. And like, it was sort of like the stone soup principle, right? Where I would say this and somebody'd be like, oh, well, I have a camera you can use. I'd love to shoot it for you. And then I would like tell somebody else and they're like, oh, well, my friend owns this coffee shop and I'm sure they'll let you shoot in it. And it became this thing that was completely imbued with magic. Like the whole thing came together in a magical way. It was obvious that the universe was conspiring to get me to create this. And essentially it was a poem from my subconscious to my conscious mind. And it was about a girl who was killing herself through her lifestyle. And one night she is in the middle of drinking herself into a stupor and a little bird flies in the window and crashes into the window and dies. And she takes that as an omen that she had better change her life lest she become like the bird. Okay. And I think there's even a line about tarot in there that says there are certain times in life where signs and symbols present themselves to you and you have to read the meaning, and it's like getting your tarot cards read. This is so before I ever conceived of being a tarot reader, right?
Yeah.
So I made this movie. And it was so amazing that I said, oh, I'm supposed to move to Los Angeles and become a filmmaker, right? I didn't know anybody in Los Angeles. I packed up my car, I divorced that guy, and I made my way down to Los Angeles. And I would love to say that I instantly got sober. I didn't. Wherever you go, there you are. You know, I ended up recreating, but within a year, maybe 2 years, I was living in an apartment in Silver Lake, off of on Sanborn, Sunset and Sanborn. I was on a second floor. I had a studio apartment, and one morning I was awakened to the sound of knocking at my window. And I go to the window and I open it up, and there's a bird sitting on the windowsill, and that bird hops inside. That bird lived with me for the next 9 months until I got sober in AA.
Ooh.
Yeah. So life imitated art, actually.
Yeah.
I created this scenario that was about a wake-up call, and then it manifested in real time in order for me to step into this new pathway or new reality. And really, that was the beginning of my, like, really, sobriety introduced me to meditation. I started to meditate very seriously in 2007. I studied with a teacher every week. Probably 12 of us would get together in a living room, and Michael Taft, who's actually a very serious meditation facilitator in the Shinzen Young tradition, would teach us meditation. So we would have like an hour meditation and then an hour Dharma talk. And that happened every Wednesday for 2 years. And that really started my practice of meditation, which has been instrumental in shaping me and bringing me into a greater awareness of the, nature of things.
And I'm sure it's the meditation has been a healthier way to, as you put it, like emotional regulation, right?
Absolutely, 100%.
And it's incredible that birds have been such a massive force in your life from that really early memory when you were like 2 or 3 years old. And it makes me wonder if that bird whose life you saved was also somehow symbolic for yourself in a way. It's like you saved that bird and set it free, and perhaps that planted a seed for you to always maybe yearn for some sort of freedom for yourself.
Or who knows, maybe the spirit of bird, which is infinite and everywhere, recognized that I saved it, and so then it came to save me. You see, like, this is the thing. This is what you start to realize, is that, in Buddhism, there's this theory called the law of dependent origination, where everything is connected. And I think it's actually the reason why tarot works, right? What right do I have to look into your energy field and see what's going on with you? Well, when I choose to attune to it, how can I not? Because I'm a part of you. We're all connected, right? And so this spirit that manifests itself as bird in our three-dimensional world had already connected with me. We'd already connected. So it knew how to reach me, right?
Yeah.
So, and then, years later, I researched, there is something called the language of the birds. And it's something that supposedly Isis had. It was the language that Isis used to call back into being, to put Osiris back together, who had been torn apart by Set. So, right.
That's incredible. Wow. That's amazing. I really appreciate you sharing those stories, and I know that you have tons more, and we'll do a part 2 someday, and you can share some of those. I do want to know, and you've touched on it obviously through your, all of the things that you've been talking about, but how would you describe your own spiritual philosophy at this point in your life? I know that's a big one, but
well, no, I just, my joke is that I'm a Buddhist who believes in God, so I guess that makes me a Hindu.
Nice, love it.
Total joke, which okay, so I've done a lot of study. I've been interested in this stuff for a long time. So I've done a lot of just self-study on sort of comparative religion. And I'm always fascinated by the crossover, the overlays, right? When you study this tradition and you study this tradition and they're arriving at the same place through different methods, like that to me is where it gets really juicy and really interesting. And so to a large degree, I kind of believe that these different world religions or traditions are not so divergent as people think, right? Like, I definitely at this point believe in reincarnation. It just makes sense to me, right? It's like, you know, if everyone could just get enlightened in a single lifetime, then more people would be enlightened walking around on the earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it takes lifetimes and lifetimes, right?
Mm.
And so that idea of sort of like karma and, oh, I have unfinished business because I had things that were grabbing me at the time of my death that propelled me into another state of being so that I could then continue to do that work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it just sort of intuitively makes sense to me. And then I really do believe that there are just multiple dimensions of reality, right? And that they don't negate each other, right? They exist simultaneously. So I will also say that a lot of my spiritual stuff, like, I am a person who is very much, in fact, I very firmly believe in reconnecting science and spirituality. There was a time in human history, in fact, the time that tarot came out of, really, where these things weren't separate. It was before the age of enlightenment or the age of reason, where Hermetic philosophy would recognized astrology and alchemy as legitimate practices that gave you insight into chemistry and astronomy and and mathematics, right? Like, I'm sorry, Pythagoras believed in magic.
Absolutely. He was a mystic.
Right? And so John Dee, I mean, you can, there's so many of these great thinkers that, and now science is so snooty and looks down its nose at this stuff until you get to a certain level. Obviously, the theoretical physicists, the quantum mechanics guys are like, no way, consciousness affects material reality and you can't ignore it. There are too many tests that prove that that's true. And so, and that's of course why the Dalai Lama has been so interested in reaching out to people in the scientific community and having a dialogue and subjecting himself to, like, neurological experiments so that they can see what's happening in the brain when people are in these deep states of consciousness. Because when you read the suttas, you start to say that these guys were talking about things 2,000 years ago that are now being confirmed by quantum physics, right?
Absolutely.
And one of the earliest books that I ever read that, like, I felt that expansion in my mind was the Dancing Wu Li Masters. And it was very much about that. It was sort of the intersection of Buddhism and quantum physics. So that also is a big part of my belief system.
Yeah.
That these two fields of awareness are not at odds in the way people think they are,
I agree.
That in fact, a huge part of my spiritual awakening has been about this movement away from black and white thinking. It's either this or it's this. It isn't either or, it's and both. And it's finding the intersection between things that awakens wisdom. That's my feeling.
I love it. Yeah, I really resonate with all of that. I've been drawn to Buddhism for maybe 12 years now. In the last couple of years, I've been diving. Well, I guess in the last year, I've been diving into Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta and stuff like that. And I'm, like you said, I love just discovering the overlaps. And I think that maybe the esoteric core of these spiritual traditions is often very aligned, and maybe the exoteric or the outer expressions are divergent, which is, that makes sense because different places, different times, different cultures. And I also think a lot about science and how, exactly like you said, I mean, there were pretty much, whether it's ancient Greece with Pythagoras, like you said, and even, Plato. I mean, I guess we wouldn't necessarily think of him as a scientist, but like these philosophers and these scientists were extremely interested in magic and the esoteric and spirituality. And it's sad that the two have developed an antagonistic relationship with each other, and it doesn't have to be that way. And they can totally fuel each other's understanding. And you said that a Buddhist who believes in God. I'm interested. What is your notion of God
I
these
mean, that's
days?
my joke. It's like God is everything
Yeah,
and nothing, right? It's like
yeah,
it's it is the state of being that gives rise to everything, right? And
yes.
I think of it in terms of, like, if I had to come up with a metaphor, it wouldn't be a person, it would be a prism, right?
Mm-hmm.
that,
Yes,
that that when light filters through the prism, it splinters out into these variations of color and form, right?
yes,
So so I don't think of it as a physical thing. I think of it
right.
as a state of being that literally creates everything through an interaction with consciousness, or maybe
Yeah,
consciousness comes out of it. I don't know.
right,
Right?
right.
But that's sort of a close proximity from what I can gather both through study and then just like intuitive experiential, right, relationship.
Yeah,
So
yeah. The prism. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I like to have an experimental spirituality, and a playful spirituality, in the sense that I like to try to, as far as God goes, I have so many ongoing shifting conceptions of God, kind of, and I think about God as the mystery, I think about God as the one, God as the all, God as the absolute or the ultimate. Um, and so I think it's useful for me, at least, to kind of, when it comes to the big questions, to hold those things lightly, because if we hold them tightly, then we start, then we start being stubborn about our own views, and we might have conflict with others if their
dogma.
views
At
don't
that point, it's
align.
dogma.
Yeah, dogma. So to me, dogma is always harmful, whether it's spiritual dogma, political dogma, scientific dogma. Two final things I like to ask people is about magic and love. And we've talked about magic, and feel free to say anything else about your, you know, basically the role that magic plays in your spiritual life, which you've kind of covered a lot of that, but we haven't really talked about love. So if you what is the function or the role or the power that love plays in your spirituality slash, understanding of reality?
Such a deep question. Because again, love can manifest on multiple levels, right? So obviously, there is the love that we think of in popular culture as being like romantic love. It's a
Right,
very Western concept, right? In fact, the Greeks had so many different words for love because there were so many different ways that it could manifest.
right.
And I feel like we are somewhat limited in our conception of what love is. We also tend to think of it as a feeling and not as much of an action. And I think
Hmm.
honestly, a huge part of my spiritual growth has been learning how to love.
Hmm.
Because obviously, coming from the family that I did, I wasn't taught what that looked like or felt like. So for a lot of my life, I've been groping around in the dark with that one, right? Is this it? I don't know. How do I know if it is? Is it supposed to feel like this? I don't know. And ultimately, what I will talk about is my experience reading cards for people. And I feel like I have had the experience of deep love, the kind of love that they call agape, right?
Yeah.
Compassionate love. So when somebody sits down in front of me, I'm a human, right? And sometimes I have this experience where I'm judging, right? My
Yeah.
conscious mind is like, oh, this person,
Yeah.
right? Like whatever it's based on, their facial expression, like the car
Right.
they drove up in, whatever it is, right? And I just know to not pay attention to that part of my
Hmm.
my mind, like, right, that's monkey mind. I have no control over it, unfortunately, but I don't have to listen to it. I
Yeah.
don't have to buy into that and make that the central focus. In fact, to the extent that I can let it play like it's the radio in the other room and concentrate all of my attention on being a channel for healing and love and wisdom. And that's what I do. And when I do it, and when I'm reading for people, I feel love for them.
Yeah.
And it is palpable. I cannot tell you how many times a total stranger would come to me for a reading. Some very deep exchange of feeling and information would come through me and come through them. And we would both be crying. And then they would say to me, "Can I hug you?" And I'd be like, "Of course." And it is such a deep connection that happens as the result of setting aside judgment and opening your heart. And I absolutely believe that that is a function of allowing spirit to move through me, that it has purified me in a way, and that it softens those hard edges that have conditionally arisen out of the difficulties that I've experienced.
Yeah.
I have a lot to say about the other kind of love too, because I don't know if you know this, but you know, I'm studying psychotherapy, right? I'm going to grad school. In fact, it's one of my missions to create or to form a methodology of a more dyadic kind of therapeutic processing that includes magic and spirituality, right? Because I think it's a mistake to not include that. That's a major part of human consciousness that if you choose to ignore it, you're doing a disservice to all of your clients.
Yeah.
So I have a lot to say about what that looks like just in the human realm in terms of like attachment theory. I've been doing a lot of study and research about that, and I have absolutely not enough time to go into it. But I feel like we as a species have a collective wound that really comes out of trauma. It's born out of trauma, right? It's and it makes us disconnected from ourselves, and it makes us incapable of really knowing how to attune to one another. And it's probably the basis of many of life's ills, right? From war to racism to environmental degradation, right? If you can't feel connected to the trees, what do you care about, like chopping them all down and commodifying them for a financial gain? Like, but if you are connected to your heart and you're connected to the spirit of everything, then you don't operate like that in the world. And so I do believe that there are, again, there are many multiple ways to come at some of these deeper issues. And I think we need all the medicine, right? We need it all, right? And so I'm like, you know, I like to be a little bit of a Renaissance person. I don't want to be a specialist. I want to know a lot. I want to know as much as I can about as many different perspectives as I can in order to be able to approach things in the most elegant way.
Oof. Yeah, I knew that you're going to school for transpersonal psychology. And I read on your website something along the lines of what you were just saying, like trying to kind of maybe develop a more integral approach to that brings in, you know, psychology and magic and even tarot and archetypes and stuff. And so I'm very, very interested in how that unfolds for you. I'm happy for you. That's awesome. And so as a last note, since we didn't touch on the practice, I mean, we kind of touched on practice because obviously reading tarot is a practice, and
meditation. You can't say enough. Meditation has been the cornerstone. Like, if I can tell you this with all honesty, if I hadn't had a deep meditation practice, you know, because I started to read cards professionally around 2011. And if I hadn't had that that groundwork laid by meditation, it wouldn't have happened. You know? The way that I access, the way that, first of all, I even have a way of connecting with these different sense spaces is through meditation. And then psychic material, I've come to understand, is really just being another means of processing information that fall outside the normal 5 sense gates.
Mm.
So meditation is really the cornerstone of my practice.
Can you say anything as a last note about what type of meditation resonates with you and has stuck with you the most?
So I started out with Vipassana, which is insight meditation. And again, it was a really important practice because it made me intimately aware of the fact that my mind is talking all the time, and then that's causing an emotional physiological response, and the two things are acting like a
Mm,
feedback loop, and then that's influencing the actions that I take. All of that awareness stems from Vipassana meditation.
cool.
But in later years, I really have added a lot of metta, which is loving kindness meditation. And it's
Hmm.
an absolute necessity because growing that ability to have compassion for yourself and others is the thing that allows you to be skillful out in the world in your interactions, right?
Right.
So that's been a huge, of great importance in later years. And
Yes.
then, based on the attachment stuff, I've been doing something called ideal parent figure protocol meditation, which is also a really profound practice of visualizing receiving the kind of care that you didn't get when you were like one, and
Mm,
creating this new storehouse of memories of what it might be like in order to have intimate, supported connection.
yeah. Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. It's almost like mindfulness and heartfulness, those type, I really like compassionate meditation and Tonglen and these practices that help me open my heart. I find that to be, I mean, I love mindfulness and I love zazen and things that aren't necessarily centered on the heart, but I feel like ever since I got into meditation, the heart-based practices are the ones that make me, they make me more excited to keep practicing in a way. Thank you so much, Erin. This was really incredible. Really incredible.
And thank you for asking me. I really appreciate sharing.
Yes.